What happens when an entire country builds its wealth on the one thing its people can no longer afford? Australia, sunshine, opportunity, one of the highest standards of living on the planet, is now home to one of the most unaffordable housing markets in the developed world. Worse than London. Worse than New York. And the gap between prices and wages is accelerating. This is the story of how Australia's housing market broke, and why the same thing may already be happening where you live. 1. The numbers that don't work. The simplest way to measure a housing crisis is to compare what homes cost to what people earn. A ratio of 3.0 or below is considered affordable by international standards. Australia's national ratio is 8.2. In Sydney, it's 13.8, the second worst in the world behind Hong Kong. That's not a stretched market. That's a broken one. Since March 2020, Australian home values have climbed 47.3%, adding roughly 280,000 Australian dollars, about $180,000 or £142,000 to the median dwelling value. At the same time, wages have barely moved. The result, 45% of a typical household's gross income now goes to servicing a new mortgage. Anything above 30% is classified as housing stress. Australia blew past that threshold years ago. Only 14% of median income households can now afford the median priced home. In Sydney, it's 10%. 3 years ago, it was 43% nationally. That's not a gradual decline. That's a generational door slamming shut. The Aussie Score, price-to-income ratio, 8.2, severely unaffordable. Affordability access, collapsed by 67% in 3 years. Mortgage stress, 45% of income. The verdict, system failure. But the numbers only tell half the story. What does this crisis actually look like at street level? 2. The human cost. When people can't buy, they rent. When more people rent, competition intensifies. When competition intensifies, rents rise. Australian rents have climbed 30% since the start of the pandemic. Median weekly rent hit 627 Australian dollars, roughly $400 or £320. Renters now spend a record 33.4% of income on rent, and that's the national average. In Sydney and Brisbane, it's significantly worse. The cascade works like this. Housing costs push home ownership out of reach, which forces more people into the rental market, which pushes rents higher, which makes it harder to save for a deposit, which keeps people renting longer. It's a loop with no exit. And at the bottom of that loop are the people with the least margin. Social housing waitlists have been growing for decades. Homelessness is rising in a country that is, by almost every metric, one of the richest on the planet. For international viewers, this is like watching the engine of a luxury car slowly seize while the driver insists everything's fine. The Aussie Score, rent increase since 2020, 30%. Rent to income, record 33.4%. Social housing weight, growing for decades. Bottom line, cascading failure. At this point, someone always says the same thing, just move somewhere cheaper. Let's talk about why that doesn't work. 3. The myths that won't die. 2 arguments come up in every housing crisis conversation, in every country. The first, just move regional. The second, it's all because of immigration. Both contain a grain of truth. Neither comes close to explaining the full picture. During COVID, Australians did move regional, in large numbers. Remote work made it possible, and housing costs made it attractive. The result? Regional house prices surged. The very migration that was supposed to solve the problem recreated it. Regional affordability in Australia is now nearly as stretched as capital city affordability. The escape hatch led to another locked room. The immigration argument is more nuanced but equally incomplete. Australia has averaged 300,000 plus net overseas migrants annually in recent years, and that does add demand, particularly in rental markets where new arrivals compete directly for available housing. Nobody serious denies that. But here's the part that complicates the simple narrative. One of Australia's strongest housing booms occurred during the COVID border closures, when net migration effectively dropped to zero. Prices surged with almost no migration at all. That tells you something important. Migration amplifies pressure in a system that's already broken. It didn't break the system in the first place. For international viewers, this pattern should sound familiar. London, Toronto, and Auckland have all run versions of this same debate, blaming population growth for a crisis that's fundamentally about policy, investment incentives, and supply failure. Immigration is one variable. The equation has a dozen others that people find less comfortable to talk about. The Aussie Score, regional escape, already priced out. Migration explanation, one factor among many. Easy answers don't exist. The call, convenient myths. So if the easy explanations don't hold up, what's actually driving this? Let's start with supply, because the numbers are damning. Point 4. The supply stranglehold. Australia has a landmass roughly the size of the contiguous United States. And yet somehow, it can't build enough houses. That paradox has a few very specific explanations, and none of them are accidents. Australian cities are among the most sprawling and low density in the developed world. That's not geography, it's zoning. Local planning rules in most Australian municipalities actively restrict medium and high-density development in established suburbs. Apartment buildings, townhouses, terraces, the types of housing that make cities affordable and efficient, face enormous regulatory friction in exactly the places people want to live. The resistance has a name: NIMBYism. Not in my backyard. Existing homeowners oppose new development near their properties because density threatens property values, changes neighborhood character, and adds congestion. The result is a system where the people who already own houses have effective veto power over whether new ones get built. That is an extraordinarily powerful incentive to keep supply constrained. On top of zoning, construction productivity has declined. It now takes longer and costs more to build a home in Australia than it did a decade ago. The federal government's housing accord set a target of 1.2 million new homes over 5 years. Current projections show that target will be missed by roughly 262,000 dwellings. That's not a small miss. That's 250,000 homes that won't exist. And here's the twist that makes supply alone an incomplete answer. Australia technically has enough dwellings to house its population. The problem is distribution and utilisation. Hundreds of thousands of properties sit underoccupied or vacant. Investment holdings, holiday homes, properties held by downsizers living in houses far larger than they need. Encouraging retirees to free up family-sized homes could help, but doing it requires tax reform, pension changes, and suitable alternatives that currently don't exist at scale. Supply matters enormously, but building more homes won't fix a crisis if the incentive structure keeps funneling those homes into the hands of people who don't need them to live in. The Aussie Score, housing shortfall, 262,000 dwellings. Zoning resistance, structural. Construction productivity, declining. Honest take, built to fail. Which brings us to the other side of the equation, because the way Australia treats housing as an investment might be the most revealing part of this entire story. 5. The investment machine. This is where Australia's housing crisis goes from being a supply problem to being a policy choice. Australia has two tax mechanisms that actively encourage property investment. The first is negative gearing, a system that allows investors to deduct losses on rental properties against their personal income tax. If your investment property costs more to hold than it earns in rent, the government effectively subsidises the shortfall. This policy cost the Australian budget $10.9 billion Australian dollars in 2023 to 2024, projected to hit $12.3 billion Australian dollars by 2024 to 2025. That's roughly the same as what many countries spend on entire public housing programs. The second is the capital gains tax discount. When investors sell a property held for more than 12 months, they pay tax on only half the profit. The combination of negative gearing and the CGT discount creates a system where losing money on rent today is financially rational as long as the property's value rises over time. It turns housing into a tax-advantaged speculation vehicle, and 2.2 million Australians have taken the bet. For international viewers, imagine your government spending the equivalent of billions of dollars every year specifically helping wealthier citizens buy second, third, and fourth properties, while first-time buyers can't afford their first. That's the structure. And any politician who proposes changing it faces immediate backlash, because millions of voters are already invested in the system staying exactly as it is. The emerging concern is institutional ownership. Build-to-rent models, where large corporations own entire apartment buildings and rent every unit, are growing in Australia and globally. This introduces a new dynamic where residential property values can continue rising even as fewer individual humans can afford to buy, because the buyer is no longer a person. It's a fund. The Aussie Score, negative gearing cost, 12.3 billion Australian dollars annually. Investors, 2.2 million, 60% negatively geared. Policy direction, unchanged. The reality, designed this way. And all of this leads to one final question, the one that sits underneath every data point and every policy debate. 6. The system nobody questions. Here is the structural truth at the center of Australia's housing crisis. It's not really about zoning or migration or construction costs, though all of those matter. It's about the fact that Australia has built its entire economic identity around rising property values. A disproportionate share of Australian household wealth is tied to property. Bank lending is overwhelmingly concentrated in residential mortgages. Retirement planning, intergenerational wealth transfer, local government revenue, all of it depends, to a degree that few other developed nations match, on house prices continuing to rise. That creates a paradox no government has been willing to confront. The crisis is rising house prices. But falling house prices would destroy the wealth of millions of existing homeowners, destabilize the banking system, and trigger a political catastrophe. Every major party knows this. The consequence is a society that's quietly splitting into two classes, those who own property, or whose parents do, and those who don't. Access to housing is no longer primarily determined by income, effort, or career success. It's determined by inheritance, by family wealth, by whether you were born into the right postcode. That's not a market correcting itself. That's a system reproducing inequality by design. The Aussie Score, wealth concentration, property dependent, political will, absent, inequality trajectory, widening. Final word, the quiet divide. Which leaves only one question, and it's the one that matters most. 7. The one thing nobody will say. Every cause we've covered, supply constraints, zoning failures, tax incentives, NIMBYism, migration pressure, construction decline, institutional ownership, traces back to one root tension that Australia has never resolved. Is housing a place to live, or an asset to profit from? The entire crisis exists in that gap. As long as housing is primarily treated as an investment vehicle, rewarded by tax policy, protected by zoning, inflated by speculation, prices will continue outpacing incomes. Building more homes helps. Reforming migration helps. But neither addresses the foundational issue. For international viewers watching this from London, Toronto, Auckland, or Los Angeles, Australia isn't an outlier. It's a preview. The same structural forces are at work in every major Western housing market. The countries that resolve this tension first will thrive. The ones that don't will end up with what Australia has now, beautiful cities that most of their own citizens can no longer afford. The crisis isn't complicated. It just requires an answer that nobody in power is willing to give. The Aussie Score, root cause, housing as investment over shelter. Fix, fundamental policy shift. Likelihood, uncertain. No debate. Until this changes, nothing changes. Australia's housing crisis isn't a mystery. The data is clear, the causes are documented, and the consequences are visible on every rental queue and auction floor in the country. What's missing isn't information. It's willingness. If this one hit home, literally, go watch Why Everyone is Suddenly Leaving Sydney. It's the human side of exactly this story. See you in the next one.